Let's talk about some other news and notes as we get moving here. As we march towards World War 396, a big story around the time is the former Mr. Perfect. He has been a big part of WWF programming. He came back for Survivor Series 95 to do commentary, and very quickly they realized, okay, he's not exactly going to be Mr. Perfect on the mic. So we've got to find another spot for him. So they start to use him in taped shows like Superstars, and they even start to involve him in a lot of storylines in late summer and early fall, including an intercontinental situation with Hunter Hearst Helmsley and Mark Marrow. But then all of a sudden, what do you know? It's time for yet another major figure to jump from the WWF to WCW. Meltzer would write, according to the Observer, Hennig met and agreed to terms with Eric Bischoff late the previous week and then no-showed his scheduled WWF television appearances on Livewire and Superstars, along with his bookings for house shows in Buffalo and Cleveland as Hunter Hearst Helmsley's second. With the no-shows, the WWF probably figured Hennig was WCW bound and had Jerry McDevitt send out the basic legal threats regarding tampering since Hennig was still under contract. The WWF was under the impression that Curt was going to debut on the November 11th Nitro in a Lex Luger type deal, although those in WCW insist that was never the plan because they were aware that Hennig still had a WWF contract and that he won't debut until February after his contract expires. A lot to unpack here. First of all, I want to talk about just your conversations with him. Who would have put you on Curt? Is this something Scott Hall puts a bug in your ear about, or were you just a big fan and started to inquire?
I don't know who made the initial contact. I'm not sure. Curt would have reached out to us, number one, because by this time in 1996 and all the legal crap that was going on between us and WWE, I would have not, stepped outside of my lane in an inappropriate way legally. So Curt would have had to come to us, and Curt would have had to establish that he really wasn't under contract, and he did have the opportunity to discuss coming to work with us. Now, I remember the first meeting I had with Curt, that took place while we were still in the CNN Center before we had moved over to the offsite offices. And I remember it specifically because Curt's dad, Larry, the Axe Hennig, attended that meeting with Curt. And it was so cool for me because as a kid, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old, living in Minnesota, Larry the Axe Hennig was the shit, man. He was the real deal. And I worked with Larry a little bit in the AWA, very, very little, because his career was kind of winding down about the time that I got there. But Larry the Axe Hennig would still do a lot of public appearances in and around Minnesota. Larry Hennig and Vern Gagne were pretty good friends and would attend a lot of those same functions. And I don't remember what year it was. It probably would have been 1989, maybe 1990. Greg Gagne and I drove up to northern Minnesota to attend a big fundraiser like Ducks Unlimited or Pheasants Forever or something like that. And we just went. I think Vern was there, obviously, and Larry the Axe was there. And it was the first time that I had met Larry, and I had met him before, but had never really sat down and had a couple beers with him and gotten to know him a little bit. And I was intimidated by him. I mean, I was Larry the Axe Hennig. He carried himself very, very well. Let's put it that way. And when Curt's dad, Larry, came to the meeting, I was like half giddy because I was still a fan. It can actually happen. There are still people that, even though you're in the business at a high level, that you meet that you go, wow, this is pretty freaking cool. And Larry the Axe Hennig was one of those really freaking cool people that here I am sitting behind this desk negotiating with a guy who I have looked up to, throughout my early teens and teenage years as a fan. It was just one of those moments that you go, wow, this life is really pretty fucking cool. If you let it be, life can be really, really cool. And it was one of those really cool moments. And that's why it stands out. I mean, I can literally picture it in my head like it was a photograph that I saw last night or a movie that I saw this morning. It was a really cool moment.
Two things to unpack here. Number one, did Larry or Curt make it clear they weren't just looking to be on camera? They wanted him to be in the ring.
That was abundantly clear. That was clear. And, it was a little bit like Randy Savage in a way. Randy had, I guess, a great opportunity to be a color commentator in WWE. He could have ridden that horse off into the sunset probably as long as he wanted to ride that particular horse. But the problem is Randy didn't want to ride that horse. Randy wanted to be in the ring, and Curt felt much the same way. Curt was pretty young when he came to me in 1996 as a performer, and he wasn't ready to walk away from it.
I guess the second thing is, what's really getting you most excited about the idea of signing Curt? A, his former in-ring stuff, B, your internal fandom, or C, hey, wait a minute, this is a quote unquote WWF guy, and I've got a big invasion storyline going on right now. This checks a lot of boxes.
Yeah, it did. But let me be really clear to the audience. It wasn't that I was a big mark for Curt.
It was his dad.
I liked Curt, and Curt was a peer of mine. Curt went to high school with my wife. There's a lot. I actually wrestled Curt's younger brother while I was when I wrestled in Minnesota. So there was connective tissue there, but I didn't, Randy Hennig was his name. Figure 4 beast crushed my guts out in a high school wrestling match against Robbinsdale. I'll never forget it. I looked up, and here's another moment. All right. Here's another moment. This is funny. And it just came to me as we're talking about this. When I'm in high school, I'm a senior in high school. I think I weighed 145 pounds or 154 pounds. I can't remember what weight class I was wrestling at the time, somewhere in that vicinity. And we're wrestling Robbinsdale. My high school is Minnetonka Senior High School. We're wrestling Robbinsdale, which is a very, very competitive wrestling school. Always has been. I don't know if it still is, but it was back then. So I find out that I'm wrestling Randy Hennig. I thought, wow, Randy Hennig, that must be, oh my God, that's Larry the Axe Hennig's son. Oh crap. And unlike Larry or Curt, Randy at the time was kind of a longer, lankier build, I guess. And I'm wrestling this guy, and I wasn't a very good wrestler. On a good day, I was pretty average in high school on a good day, but I always made varsity. I was always able to hold whatever, weight division I was willing to wrestle in at the time. I could beat anybody else on my team for that spot. But once we got outside of high school, I was just, like I said, I was very average on a good day. And Randy was really good. And I'm in the third period of our match, and I'm figure 4, thanks to MMA now and UFC, everybody pretty much knows what a figure 4 is. Randy's on my back. He's got me figure 4 around my waist. He's squeezing my guts out. I'm in the center of the mat, and I'll never forget, I'm gassing. He's crushing my ribs. And I look up, and there's Larry the Axe Hennig sitting there with he's leaning in. He's on the first bench, in the bleachers, right in front of me, maybe 30 feet away. He's leaning in like this on his elbow and just staring a hole through me while this kid is squeezing my guts out. Yeah. And here I am sitting across from him negotiating a deal for his son. It was just a cool moment. I don't think I realized it then as much as I do now, how cool that moment was. But I was more of a fan of Curt's work. I mean, keep in mind, I became very familiar with Curt in the AWA. I think him and Nick Bockwinkel had some of the best matches to this date I've ever seen in terms of not only physicality and timing, believability, psychology, execution on all levels, whether it be on the mic or in the ring. The Curt Hennig, Nick Bockwinkel series of matches that took place in the AWA, I think stand the test of time to this day to be some of the best matches ever. And that's what I was excited about.
Let's go down the rabbit hole on the way Curt is leaving Vince. Meltzer would say as the week went on, Curt and Vince had at least one phone conversation in which everything was settled, or at least that's what those in the WWF were of the impression of. By late in the week, the belief was not only that Curt would return for Superstars in the pay-per-view, but that he would be signing a new big money contract with the WWF as a wrestler. But then Curt no-showed a personal appearance on the 16th and the pay-per-view on the 17th, and the WWF realized Curt is all but gone. Quote, there must have been major underlying heat between Curt and Vince for Curt to not only jump, but also burn Vince and the company on 2 consecutive weekends on the way out the door. The story going around is that Curt had no interest in returning to the ring, as he was a very short time away from a lifetime disability settlement in his Lloyd's of London policy, which would have paid him a reported $300,000 lump sum. However, something happened, which Hennig blamed Vince for, which led to Lloyd's not going to pay him the lump sum, which without the lump sum probably would have lessened Hennig's reasons for not wanting to return to the ring. Lloyd's, which no longer sells disability insurance to pro wrestlers after having to pay out such a high percentage of those that purchased policies in the short period they were offered. Rick Rude, Ted DiBiase, Road Warrior Animal, Curt Hennig, and Nikita Koloff, among others, all collected on these policies. In the case of all but Animal and Curt, they collected the big lump sum for permanent disability and have never returned to the ring. When he decided he was going to return due to the bitterness with McMahon, he decided to contact Bischoff and WCW. If it actually happened this way, then Bischoff and WCW would be much less in jeopardy of a tampering charge if Curt came to them rather than the other way around. So you sort of laid out, you thought that's what happened, and here it is. But now it feels like, the Lloyd's of London thing, I don't know how deep we want to go on that. Clearly it's no longer a thing, but it does feel a little weird that Curt and Vince would have a conversation, seemingly come to terms and make an agreement, and then Curt just straight up no shows. Did you ever talk to Curt about the way he was exiting the company, or does it not come up?
Never came up. To me, I didn't care. I wasn't involved in the drama as long as Curt was free and clear, and I wasn't stepping outside of my legal boundaries at that time. I really didn't care what the drama was behind the scenes. None of that mattered to me. It never even came up. I didn't ask and he didn't offer, and it was just never a conversation. The only conversation we had is, are you free and clear? Can you come to work for us? And if he represented, he meaning Curt, and in this case, Larry, represented that Curt was free and clear to negotiate, I have clean hands. I need not do any more diligence other than the representation that I was given at that point. Now, clearly we would have done more diligence before we, entered into a formal agreement. We would have made sure and covered our ass, particularly in 96, because of all the litigation that was going on with WWE at the time. But beyond that conversation, I really didn't care.
It's such an interesting time. You hear all these guys over the years who had almost like a father-son relationship with Vince. And then you've got other guys who, really just kind of want to stick it to him a little bit. That's what this feels like to me. Did the tone or tenor of your conversations with either, Larry or his son, Curt, lean on, well, that bastard Vince, or, were they burying Vince, or were they frustrated with what's the tone and tenor there?
That's a really good question. And it's interesting because often, and there's one of the things that I learned early on when I got into management, and it seems like common sense. And I think everybody that hears what I'm about to say is going to go, oh, well, yeah, of course, that makes sense. But until it starts happening to you, and you realize the position you're in, when I would hear things about Vince McMahon before getting into management, when I was a fly on the wall, when I was watering the plants and taking out the garbage, and nobody really paid any attention to who Eric Bischoff, this new C-Squad announcer, is, you'd hear all kinds of things, because I wasn't a threat to anybody. Nobody was trying to impress me, and nobody was really nervous about anything that I would hear. So you hear a lot of stuff, right? And I'd hear good things and a fair amount of bad things, negative things about Vince. And even at that time, I was like, yeah, whatever. It's one person's opinion. People are going to say what they're going to say to make themselves feel better about themselves. That's human nature. And I was aware of that even in the early 90s when I first got to WCW. But once you get into management, and once you start making decisions and creating opportunities for people, all of a sudden I became much more attuned to the type of conversations I was having with people. And it became so obvious to me early on that people are always going to tell you what they think you want to hear.
Yeah.
People assumed that I wanted to hear, what an evil person Vince McMahon was, or how, oppressive he was, or whatever they think I would want to hear at that point, because they really believed I was like out to get Vince McMahon, and I wasn't, despite the narrative that I created, by the way, as a marketing tool. So I don't blame people for having that impression, because I clearly worked pretty hard to give it to them, give people that impression. But it wasn't the case. So I'd hear, people start telling me things that honestly, I didn't. Number one, I don't want to hear them because they don't factor into any of my process. They're not going to have any effect on how I move forward. So let's just not even have that conversation. And the other part of me was that the more people would try to impress me with things like that, or try to, I guess, develop a relationship with me by telling me the things that I wanted to hear, the less genuine I thought of those people, the less honest I thought those people were. So I had a tendency to shut those conversations down right away, because I didn't want to hear things that would make me lose respect for the people that I was negotiating with. So I would make it pretty clear right off the bat that none of this matters. Let's talk about what we're going to do. Let's not talk about what happened there, because it just wasn't relative to me. But I would hear a lot. And some of it I would take note of, because some of the things that I would hear about the way Vince did business was either, something that impressed me in a good way, or it was something that, made me realize, well, I don't want to do that. But more often than not, I just looked at it as bullshit. I just looked at it as people telling me what they thought I wanted to hear. I didn't put a lot of credibility into the things that I heard, because there's always two sides to every coin. And when you're talking to talent, they're going to give you the side of the coin that either blows smoke up your ass or makes them, appear to be more valuable and important than they really are. It's just the way the world turned.
So Larry and Curt were sort of shitting on Vince a little bit in the meeting?
No. I mean, it may have started out, what went down, and there may have been a cursory discussion in the context of, are you guys really free and clear? Curt,
right.
Are you really free and clear? And there would have been probably an explanation of that situation with WWE, but it would have quickly moved beyond that into, where are we going from here, as opposed to, tell me what a dick Vince McMahon really is. Give me some dirt. Oh, my boy. Now, Jim Barnett would have been negotiating with Curt. It would have been an entirely different conversation, and we would have heard all kinds of things, but that wasn't my style.
Let's talk about Mean Gene. You know what? Before we talk about Gene, we didn't touch on Lloyd's at all there. How much of a discussion was Lloyd's of London in your time of WCW when you're dealing with talent?
It was an issue with certain talents. You mentioned the Road Warriors. Anytime their name came up, it was like, yeah, but there's a Lloyd's of London issue. Rick Rude was probably the one that was the most acute, his relationship with Lloyd's of London, because Rick, I think you mentioned it, Rick Rude had cashed in on a Lloyd's of London policy that prevented him. Rick took the cash, but in the process of taking the cash that he was able to take from Lloyd's of London, I don't know what the amount is. I've heard and read different things over the years. But once Rude took that check, part of taking that check meant that he was permanently disabled from performing in the ring as a wrestler. And in order for Rick Rude to perform again as a wrestler, he would have had to satisfy or return, basically, the lump sum of cash that he received, because he clearly wasn't unable to return. He, in fact, became able to return in the ring, at least in Rick Rude's mind. So Rick Rude came to me and wanted me to pay off his Lloyd's of London policy for cash that he received and had already spent, whatever it is, on his house or his cars or his family or his bills or food or whatever. But the money was gone. So Rick received a lump sum. Rick proceeded to spend that lump sum, invest it, whatever he did with it, I don't know. And then a couple of years later, when Rick wanted to get back into the ring, he came to me and said, Eric, could you pay off my Lloyd's of London policy so that I can get back into the ring again? As much as I liked Rick Rude at the time, and we were personal friends, There was no way I could do that. Despite the, ATM Eric, narrative, and that I had Ted Turner's checkbook and I could do whatever I want and I wasn't responsible to anybody. That's all bullshit. And clearly, if I would have said, "Hey, Harvey, guess what? My buddy Rick Rude over here, we're gonna write it. We're gonna write Lloyd's of London a check for $300,000, and then, oh, by the way, I want to pay Rick. We got to be fair to Rick. We're going to give him $350, $450, $500 a year, $650 a year, whatever he was worth at that time as a talent in the ring." That conversation would have been a real short conversation with Harvey. So I wasn't able to do that. And that was the underlying tension between Rick and I that carried forward all the way until his unfortunate passing. And one of the reasons why, when I went to Rick's funeral, we've covered this before, but his family was, certain members of his family in particular, were very upset with me because Rick expressed his frustration to them about me. "I can't believe Eric Bischoff won't do this. God, he's not letting me back into the ring. He won't pay off that Lloyd's of London policy." Because I'm sure in Rick's mind, when he's hearing about the kind of money Hogan was making, and he's hearing about the kind of money that other people are making, and he's seeing the success of WCW unfold right before his very eyes, he wanted a piece of that action. And a lot of that resentment or frustration that Rick felt, I don't know. Unfortunately, Rick passed before we had a chance to work it out. But I was the focal point of it because I wouldn't do what Rick wanted me to do with Lloyd's of London in order for Rick to get back into the ring. I couldn't do it. It's not that I didn't want to do it. I couldn't do it. And Lloyd's of London, I think, I don't want to say this is a stretch, but I think part of Rick Rude's issue with drugs and alcohol was the result of the frustration and the position that he was in, having cashed out on a Lloyd's of London policy and realizing, you know what, that was a mistake, and not being able to fix it.